All right. Great. So again, welcome everyone. Welcome to our penultimate event of our In Conversation series. Today we're going to hear from Dr. Sarah Lamble, who is a reader in Criminology and Queer Theory at Birkbeck. And she is, they are in conversation with PhD students about their work together on a joint project about sex and intimacy in prison. Let's get straight into it. Can you tell me a little about yourselves and about your research?
Should I go first? Okay, I just want to start by saying thanks very much for inviting us, and thanks to everyone who's come along today. So my research and work is broadly focused on questions of gender, sexuality, and criminal justice, with a specific focus on prisons and punishment, but also their alternatives. So I'm really interested in things like transformative justice. And I draw from queer, feminist, trans, and anti-racist theory to approach questions of how to reduce harm and violence in society. And that's the kind of broad frame for a lot of the work that I do. And in addition to the project that we're going to talk about today, I also have another project that is looking at what we might call the carceral politics of the gender wars in Britain. So I'm really looking at how punitive politics are shaping public discussions about trans rights. So over to you, Lizzie.
Hi everyone, just a second saying thanks, and thanks for coming on a really hot day as well. If you're in London, it feels like the world is melting, because it is, I guess. But yeah, so I'm a second year PhD student within the Department of Criminology, which is in the School of Law. And my PhD is focused towards surveillance and governance. And in it, I'm trying to reconceptualize surveillance as human and sensory from within the UK gender segregated bathroom space, using queer and trans perspectives. So the aim is to rethink surveillance away from notions of it as machinic or as something done by institutions onto bodies, and instead examine the ways in which human capacities for detection, so like sound, smell, sight, taste, which I'm not doing in the bathroom, I'm doing touch, impact how we kind of produce, survey, and regulate and govern ourselves and our everyday spaces. And as well as my academic life, I also run a queer mental health community service in North London. And this is for LGBT people. And within that, we house a project that supports people who are seeking asylum on the grounds of sexuality or gender identity, as well as supporting people who have granted refugee status with their mental health. And I think one of the things that attracted me to Birkbeck, and one of the things I really enjoy about Birkbeck, is that you can do multiple things and kind of be multiple people as well as an academic person. And I think that that really kind of benefits your research and really broadens the scope of your knowledge as well. And just, I don't know if you were going to say it anyway, Lamble, but just a content warning. It's fairly evident, but we're going to be talking about sex and sexual activity, but also sexual harm, sexual assault, and institutional violence. So feel free to quit at any time you like.
Thanks for that, Lizzie. It's a really good point to give warning. That all sounds fantastic. I'm really looking forward to hearing more about specifically about this project and about your research. So moving on to that, you are both working together on a joint project researching sex and intimacy in prison, as we've said, and you can see on the screen. Could you tell us about the project and sort of where you are now with it and where you are intending to go in the future?
Great, thanks. So this is a joint project that Lizzie and I are both involved in alongside another colleague from Birkbeck, Tanya Srissier, and a colleague from Goldsmiths, Alex Dimmick. And the project is really trying to explore the role of sex, desire, and sexual intimacy as an aspect of governance in prison. And so what we mean by that is we're interested in how expressions of sexuality, of desire, and intimacy are not sort of just isolated or discrete occurrences, but potentially play a role in everyday power dynamics. So the kind of expressions of desire or expressions of sexual identity or sexual relationships, how they kind of play out in the everyday domain of the prison, and therefore become relevant because of the power dynamics in how prisons are governed and managed. And the motivation for this is partly because previous research on sexuality and intimacy, particularly in the British context, from our view has been quite limited. There's a kind of tension between, on the one hand, there's been a kind of pervasive denial about the role of sex and sexuality and intimacy in prisons, a kind of sense that it doesn't happen in British prisons, it's not an issue, it's not a concern. And then on the other hand, there's a kind of anxiety and worry about it, that there's a concern that excessive sexuality or expressions of sexuality can lead to kind of disorderly behavior or lead to kind of problems in the prison. And so you see this kind of tension between denying it as an issue on the one hand and being very anxious and worried about it as a kind of key concern on the other. And so that's what we mean about this kind of ambivalence about a place without sex or a place where sex is a kind of constant threat. And then the other kind of way in which I think a lot of the existing literature talks about it is thinking about sex and sexuality as almost a kind of exceptional thing. So there's an assumption, again, that it's either an issue that only pertains to LGBT identified people, or it's an issue that pertains to people who are seen as having excessive sexual desire, so people who are labeled or identified as sex offenders. And this kind of thinking about sex also in a very kind of reductive way about sex as an act, and not thinking about the role that desire plays within the prison context. So people have sexual desires and sexual expression, and there can be sexual dynamics in relationships, whether they are acted out or not. But there's this kind of not always attention to the way in which that happens in prison. And there's this kind of idea that the identities or expressions that you might have had outside of prison suddenly stop when you come into prison. And we think the prison walls are much more porous in the sense that your identities and your experiences outside prison travel with you in prison, and they also, when you leave prison, they also come outside prison. And so we're trying to think about sexuality in a much broader way, in a much kind of queerer way, and not limit it to particular identities or kind of narrow understandings of sex and desire. I don't know if you want to, I'll talk a little bit about the specific aims of the project in a minute, but did you want to add anything to that, Lizzie?
No. I kind of expand a little bit more, particularly on the exceptionality point in regards to why the project is important, but I think summarized it very well.
Great. So the specific aims of the project are to really think about the role that sex, sexuality, and intimacy plays in everyday governance in prisons. So in that sense, we're interested in the relationships between prisoners, but also between prisoners and staff, and also the kind of the role that broader prison culture plays. So anyone who's spent time in prison knows that often there's lots of like sexual banter or chat that happens within the prison context. There are lots of different ways in which sexuality and sexual expression and intimacy are managed and regulated, because obviously prisons are places where people are held in very close proximity. And so intimacy, various forms of intimacy are inevitable within the prison. And so we're interested in really thinking about how that kind of plays out on an everyday level. And so we're using queer theory as a frame to kind of rethink some of the existing scholarship on sex in prison. Again, that particularly the scholarship that thinks about sex as a very kind of discrete and a limited act or occurrence. And so in order to do this research, we're undertaking a pilot study that will involve ex-prisoners. We'll be interviewing ex-prisoners on their experiences around sex and intimacy in prison. And the idea of that is to kind of speak to formerly incarcerated people about their experiences in order to kind of get a sense of whether these issues have an impact on things like prisoner safety, mental health, and well-being, which we think they do, but we want to gather some empirical evidence to make that case more clear. And we're hoping to do a larger project that would be in prisons involving prisoners. And so we're seeking input from ex-prisoners at this point on the kinds of research methods that we could use, so that we're not kind of just imposing a particular research method, but we're really getting input from those who have been inside to give us their thoughts on how would be the best way to approach these topics, particularly because they're very sensitive. They can involve a lot of vulnerability for people in talking about these things. And, you know, there can be a lot of stigma around issues of sex and sexuality. And so we want to get input on how we design a larger project going forward. Do you want to add anything to that, Lizzie? No? Okay, great.
So in terms of why it's important, there we go. Obviously, we think it's really important, and there are lots of reasons, but we've kind of picked 4 to go through here, some of which we've alluded to already, but some are kind of points in and of themselves. The first is around this lack of knowledge, or what Stevens has called this culture of denial, that about sex in prison, about how it happens, who's having sex, what impacts it has, what relationship sex has in terms of staff and management and prisoner relationship, and the way that the kind of denial about this has a negative impact on people in prisons' sexual, emotional, and mental well-being. And we see this denial and lack of knowledge in a few different places around and within the prison. So away from academia, sex in prison isn't really talked about, or when it is, it's kind of done through a frame of taboo or salaciousness. And in our research so far, we found news stories about sex in prison, but these are overwhelmingly about prison staff having romantic and sexual relationship with prisoners, and don't mention relationships between prisoners themselves. And these are also mostly in local news rather than mainstream papers, and they're couched in a kind of sensationalist language where it's usually a female staff member who's kind of been seduced by the evil criminal mastermind male prisoner and has compromised the security and the safety of the prison. And these relationships, they're presented as exceptional rather than commonplace and newsworthy in that exceptionalism. And they don't mention sex in prison more broadly between prisoners, only these kind of occasional excursions by staff. And then within academic research about prison, there's also a lack of literature that considers issues of sexual intimacy as an aspect of everyday governance. And there's no existing work that involves direct empirical research with staff and prisoners on the meanings that they themselves attach to sex and intimacy in institutional settings. And the UK studies that do exist, there's one from 2004, which was research with former prisoners' experiences specifically of coercive sex. Another one in 2013 and 2014 by the Howard League. And then Stevens, who I've referenced, she interviewed ex-prisoners only from the male estate in 2017. And these are all quite limited in their scope, and they don't look at how sex and intimacy is occurring specifically in relationship to prison management and governance. And so what our project is doing is intervening into that space to remedy the theoretical gap. And we also know that sex in prison can be used as a tool of violence, just like outside of prison. And this isn't being addressed sufficiently by prison authorities. And when we looked at industry publications, like articles within the Prison Service Journal, self-harm, violence, bullying, that all, of course, directly impact prisoners' well-being, they're being studied without any reference to sex and intimacy at all. And even though we know from first-hand accounts from people in prison that sex and intimacy are directly bound up in these broader issues of well-being. And so this means that inside prison, the combination of the deprivation of sex and intimacy and then the ongoing denial of its existence and kind of strange management of it when it is accepted to exist, they both kind of have key roles in shaping and producing very coercive and harmful practices. And second, again, that we kind of touched upon, is that the project is going to trouble this assumption that sex, sexuality, and intimacy in prison are only relevant for and also only occurring between LGBT prisoners and people who have been in prison for sexual offences. And so with LGBT prisoners, the assumption is that because it's a single sex space or a gender segregated space, it's only gays having sex. But we know that it's much more complicated than that. And we also know that sexual identities within the site are far less binary and not as heteronormative as that. And in terms of people who have been in prison for sexual offences, they're kind of conceptualised through notions of sexual deviancy and unhealthiness. And the literature is about managing these unhealthy sexual desires and about limiting libido. And it's also, interestingly, about the sex that they have outside of the prison and the fantasies that they have outside of the prison. So even those articles that talk about sex in prison in relationship to sex offenders, it still isn't saying that any of those fantasy worlds are happening within prison. It doesn't acknowledge prison as a sexual site. So what this is doing is creating prison as a sexless space where there are either only particular zones or particular groups of people who are having sex or who have sexual identities. But prisons are not hermetically sealed, and prisoners are just people that have been put into prison. So of course there's still going to be sexual desires, urges, fantasies and energies, as well as relationships. And these are felt and experienced in different ways, and that's what our project is going to be looking towards. And there's plenty of evidence of this in anecdotal first-hand accounts of prison experiences. And the third reason why it's an important project is kind of relatedly, we want to demonstrate that the conventional notions of things like sexual harm, coercion and sexual health don't necessarily easily map onto the prison experience, and they require their own study. So, for example, transactional sex outside of prison and transactional sex within prison carries very different meanings and very kind of different impacts. And there are some first-hand accounts that also consider all sex between staff and prisoners to be coercive due to the power imbalance, whilst others maintain that it's a legitimate romantic relationship. And as well, what kind of constitutes sexual harm in a site that is always already making bodies unhealthy, or what constitutes sexual health, sorry. So this is kind of also to draw attention to the complicated nature of these terms in the first place and their nuances outside of the prison site. And then finally, the research is coming in the context of major reckonings with the harms of sexual coercion and harassment that are occurring within kind of big institutions, partly through the #MeToo movement. But in terms of prisons and other institutions of confinement, it hasn't really been discussed yet, and it's not really been explored, as well as kind of closed mental health wards, secure hospitals and detention centres. At the same time, the COVID-19 pandemic has drawn attention to the ways in which isolation and prohibited intimacy in the outside world, which kind of came about in the early stages of the lockdown, when everything from kind of casual sex and hookups to kind of being intimate and seeing a long-term partner was prohibited. So conversations are now being had around the significance of this physical, emotional and sexual intimacy to maintaining a good well-being. And that's something that's really rarely thought of in terms of the prison setting. Over to you, Sarah.
Oh, do you want me to talk? Okay, I wasn't sure if we were going to talk about what brought us to the project, and then go to the what's next. I guess we can do either.
I think we're going to do I thought that we were going to do the next steps, and then we can kind of get rid of the slides maybe and have.
Great. Apologies. I'm going out of order. So just in terms of the next steps at the moment, so we are presenting, there's been a lot of kind of methodological issues that have come up with this project. So again, you think about the kind of sensitivity around these issues. How do you provide a space where people can talk about these issues? Particularly for people in a prison setting, it's like even getting access into the prison is an issue. And then, you know, how freely people are going to be able to talk about these issues is a kind of concern. So there's been lots of things that have come up around the methods that we're using, and also what it means to kind of talk to people inside prison and talk to people outside of prison. And so we'll be presenting on some of that at the Law and Society Association conference next month in Lisbon. We'll be conducting some pilot interviews with formerly imprisoned people over the next few months. And that will be our kind of pilot project to kind of gather some initial findings and use that as a basis to then think about pursuing a larger project that would be an in-prison project. And in the meantime, we are working on an article that's a review of the literature to date and trying to reframe some of the literature along the lines that Lizzie and I have been talking about. And so that's just looking at what is already out there and in some ways piecing things together, because sexuality sometimes comes up in these very kind of comes up a little bit here and a little bit there. And so it's really about piecing things all together and trying to kind of connect the dots, and sort of make the case for why we think this broader approach to thinking about sexuality, and specifically the importance of sexuality, sex and intimacy with respect to governance. We're sort of making the case why this matters in that article.
Thanks so much for going through all of that. It all sounds absolutely fascinated. And then, as you sort of alluded to talking about earlier, I'm really interested in what brought each of you to this project, sort of how you got here, what's interesting about it for you specifically.
Shall I start? Yeah. Okay. So I've been, with my non-academic hat on, I've been doing sort of prisoner justice advocacy work for about 20 years now, first in the Canadian context, and then later, more recently in the British context. And I'm also part of an organization called the Bent Bars Project, which is a pen pal project for imprisoned LGBTQ+ people in Britain and Northern Ireland. It's basically, you know, we match people outside prison with people inside prison to write to each other as a form of kind of mutual aid and support. But back from when I was like going into prisons on a more regular basis in the Canadian context, but also from what people write to us in the Bent Bars Project, it's really clear that sexuality and intimacy and sex actually comes up quite a lot in people's experiences. At least that's what's kind of conveyed. And again, when I used to go into the prisons on a more regular basis, it was always the kind of the dynamics around the kind of overt presence around sex and sexuality was very like it was very prominent. And I was always sort of struck by the fact that people didn't really talk about it or kind of acknowledge it. And so I think, and we see this in the literature, I was always surprised that the literature doesn't really engage with it. So there's this kind of gap, I think, between what is happening in the prisons and what the scholarship is in talking about or considering or not considering what is happening. And so that was kind of one motivation for me. And also the other motivation was really around well-being and harm reduction. And so, you know, we have concerns that things like bullying and harassment, I mean, we know that bullying and harassment is something that comes up particularly for queer and trans prisoners. It's a very regular thing. You know, Bent Bars recently did a survey of our trans and non-binary members, and the kinds of things they were reporting in terms of harassment and bullying was very acute, that was related to their sexual identities. But I think we haven't always explored how this plays out, not just for LGBT prisoners, but also for other prisoners in terms of, you know, sex for trade. You know, people often use sex as a kind of barter system to be able to get access to things on the canteen or to kind of navigate power relations. And so when does that become an expression of agency where people are trying to get what they need when they need to survive in prison? And when is that
Has Sarah frozen for everyone, or is it just me? Lizzie, you're on mute.
something that is
I
used?
had frozen. No, they've frozen. Are you back?
Oh no.
You back?
Yeah, can you still hear me?
Yes, now we can.
Yeah. Okay. It's probably a sign I was going on too much. I don't know at what point I cut off. But anyway, sort of a big motivation for me is also a kind of harm reduction motivation in really thinking about if we don't attend to the implications of how sex and intimacy and sexuality is governed in a kind of everyday sense, we may be missing important elements of how violence and harm play out in the prison, and therefore missing important ways in which we might reduce harm and violence in prison. And I'll hand it over to you, Lizzie.
Yeah, thank you. So I can speak a little bit kind of more like practically academically how I came to the project. That might be useful if anyone's like thinking of doing a PhD or is doing a PhD. But before that, so I mentioned I work in a queer mental health setting, and I'm kind of generally very interested in interpersonal relationships from a kind of psychosocial perspective, particularly around identity, and a natural part of that being sexuality and kind of sex and intimacy. And so I'm really interested in exploring the impact of not just like the physical acts of sex within prison, but the ways in which the kind of sexual energy of prison affects and kind of intermingles with people's emotional and mental well-beings, and how that also kind of rubs up against and interfaces with how people can construct their identity and kind of carry themselves inside the site and outside the site. And then in terms of kind of academically, so I can kind of trace the thread, I suppose, of this project back to my first master's at LSE, which is where I came across Lamble's work first and was like, right, I'll go to Birkbeck then. But I was writing on the social response to a gender fraud case, and gender fraud is basically the vitiation of consent via deception of gender in a sexual act. And it was at that point that what I'm really interested in researching is the interfacing of governance, transness, and sexualities in everyday moments and spaces, and again in interpersonal contexts of kind of two people having sex, but then also how these are policed at a more institutional level and in kind of a more everyday level. So I then did another master's specifically in criminology, and Lamble was my supervisor, and now I'm doing a PhD and they're still my supervisor. And that kind of encapsulates a few things that overlap with this project around kind of governance and morphic interpersonal sexualities. And what's also quite interesting from the literature is there's quite a lot of kind of sexualized surveillance going on that appears in kind of jokes and banter. So people make jokes and will have kind of ongoing banter if someone looks like they masturbate a lot, or like the telltale signs that two people are having sex. That's also been very interesting to kind of explore more. So I guess my interest in is kind of to an extent culminates with this project, but is obviously not ending with this project.
I think that both of you have very much picked up there on sort of the part of what you're looking at is this sort of how does governance interact with the personal, I suppose. And I find that very interesting. I mean, my own research looks at sort of intersectionality, and so it's very much sort of how do these systems of governance interact with who we are as people, form their own systems, as it were, that are then almost self-governing, as you've sort of alluded to. So for both of you, what's the thing that you found most interesting about working on this project so far?
You go first this time, Lizzie.
All right. So there's lots of things that are interesting. I think I'll kind of highlight two things. The first is getting to see the development of what will hopefully one day be a very large project from the ground up has been really interesting, and also really fascinating experience, and very valuable for me as someone that is potentially entering into academia and will want to do bigger projects as well. So getting to be involved in the shaping of the project it feels very kind of rewarding and meaningful. And it's also been really nice working within a team doing that doesn't exploit my labour as a PhD student and kind of bottom of the rung early career academic. I don't even think I can say early career because I don't have an academic career, but PhD student in a kind of broader context at Birkbeck and nationally, where people at kind of my level are exploited for labour, and research assistants are often kind of put in positions where they're never paid fairly, but that their time isn't taken into account and things like that. So it's been very nice working within a project team that respects me in that way. And on that note, if anyone is a PhD student in the audience or is planning to be one, I would recommend and encourage that you join the union at Birkbeck and take part in that. It's really important. It's our current learning conditions. It could be one day your working conditions. And the kind of second point that I want to talk about is regarding the content of the project, because it's been really fascinating to come across so much anecdotal evidence that is relatively easy to find online. Like there are quite a lot of prison blogs of people who have been inside and who are being very forthright and honest about what happens in prison in terms of sex. And like Laura said, the fact that it's just kind of not talked about, but it's so obviously happening. And a recent Freedom of Information request showed that there's a prevalence of these relationships going on. So the Ministry of Justice, to an extent, is aware of it, and that's not. It's this strange, like, thing that happens where it's aware, people are aware of it, but no one's kind of talking about it. And I think that reconsidering the prison as a sexual site in that way is really fascinating, and will kind of expand lots of different notions of governance and kind of governance within institutional settings. And it's also been very interesting to see the theories that the anecdotal evidence and the theories that we come across in play. So I was visiting a friend in prison a couple of months ago in a youth offender unit for young men and young trans women, and the female staff were just like really openly flirting with the prisoners, and like kind of calling across the visitation room, being very kind of touchy-feely. It was very much just a part of the space. No one was particularly kind of commenting on it. It just looked commonplace. And so, yeah, it was just fascinating to kind of be like, oh, okay, interesting. And seeing the way that what we're kind of reading is very much alive in the site. That's been very interesting, definitely.
Yeah, just to pick up on that, first I want to say I'm always very glad to hear when PhD students involved in projects like this feel that their working conditions are fair and decent. And I think that is actually amongst the team, when we as feminist researchers it's not just we're taking a feminist approach to the content that we're looking at, we're also taking a feminist approach in terms of labor relations, and it's really, and work, and really trying to be attentive to that. And I think the reality is those power dynamics can be tricky to navigate because we're not all in equal positions. And so trying to make sure that we are doing work in a collaborative and fair way is something that I think is an important thing to consider. And again, if you are someone who's potentially going to be involved in a project like this, I think it is, I would echo Lizzie's encouragement to join your local union. Because that's an important way to shape the conditions of your current or future employment. Picking up on some of the content things that Lizzie mentioned, I think what I've been actually quite fascinated by is just the volume of stuff that we have found that is relevant. And like Lizzie has done a fantastic job of really digging in all sorts of different places to find. It's kind of like you're finding little tidbits here and there where sexuality comes up as a comment in passing, or things come up that you wouldn't necessarily think of. So, we talk a little bit about things like clothing policies, right? So there's lots of policies for visitors that, if women come in to visit someone in prison, they're not allowed to wear low-cut cup tops, or they're not allowed to wear spaghetti straps, or they're not allowed to wear a short skirt, or any of these kinds of things. And on the face of it, people might not think much about that, but that's about regulating sexuality. And there's many ways in which I think sexuality and intimacy comes up in the prison in different kinds of ways that just aren't overtly considered. And so I thought we would find much less than we have. And even though it is really about piecing things together, I think we've already got a huge body of evidence, and we haven't even done any interviews yet. So I think that in itself is quite interesting. And I think the other thing that I find most interesting is the complexity of the power relations and the power dynamics. So even the kind of cases that Lizzie was mentioning around, when prison officers have relationships with prisoners, and what that means and how those are being navigated, and also how they're being reported in the media. And often how often they aren't being reported in the media. And so we know that those dynamics or those relationships are happening. And yet, on the one hand, they're sometimes covered in very kind of salacious ways. And in other ways, they're not really talked about. So there've been some cases that I was very surprised didn't get a lot more media attention, cases involving governors and things like that. And so those power dynamics, I think, are very complicated to really unpack and identify what's going on and how to kind of think about how to reduce harm in the prison. So yeah, those are the kind of interesting things for me.
Thanks both. That's, yeah, really interesting to hear for us as well. And I'm going to echo, it's so nice to hear a PhD student saying that they feel that, you know, they're very valued, and that they're sort of treated with respect with the team that they're on. You know, from a student union point, that's, you know, everything that we want to hear, really. And again, I would echo the point about yeah, joining your union if you're a PhD student who's going to be working on a project like this, or, you know, undertaking teaching work or anything like that, both the UCU and the Students' Union as well. And on that note, sort of final structured question that I have for both of you is, do you have any advice for current or future PhD students?
Do you want to take this one first, Lizzie?
Sure. So this is just two things. Well, okay, they're just from my perspective, they're from my experience, so they're not, you know, like written in stone, but maybe they'll be helpful. The first is around kind of taking any and every opportunity that looks interesting to you, especially even if you feel like you can't do it, or you feel like you're not qualified enough, or you feel like, you know, you're an imposter. Just do it anyway. Like, for me, the feeling of I don't belong in this space, or I'm an imposter in this space, is not as bad as thinking back and being like, oh, I wish I'd gone for that, or I wish I'd taken part in that. And chances are everyone else is feeling pretty similar to you in terms of feeling like an imposter. It seems like it's fairly kind of rampant at academic level and kind of every level as well in life. And I guess if you're feeling uncomfortable, it's probably a good thing. And it will be a way of kind of you pushing yourself. But just to caveat that, taking every opportunity is also a really good way of finding your own work boundaries and your own personal boundaries, and learning what your own capacity is, and learning that saying no to additional work or saying no to taking something on is as powerful and as beneficial to you as saying yes to everything, particularly to push home the union point in a kind of culture where excessive workloads are commonplace and you're just expected to do the work because it's, you know. And also it's the same in the mental health sector. Like, you rely on your goodwill is relied on to get the work done, even if it means you're not getting paid for that work. So knowing what your limits are is really important. And then the second one is really kind of brief, which is just about making sure that you have perspective. When you're doing your PhD, it can be quite kind of all-encompassing, and it's important to remember that there are other things going on. Like, go and do other things, go and have other hobbies, do other creative things, have other jobs without kind of burning out. And also, like, have friends outside academia, and make sure that the friends are kind of there to support you, because it can be extremely stressful doing a PhD. I don't know anyone that hasn't found it extremely stressful, and, you know, you're spending 3+ years to an extent by yourself writing your own work, and it can be quite easy to pin your self-worth on how good, like, your chapters are and whether you had a good supervision. So it's important to make sure that you know that there are other things going on, you have other skills, you've got other people around you, and that will hopefully be quite a good way to kind of keep you healthy, and also get people that are willing to read lots of drafts, because that's really helpful too.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like what I have to say is probably a bit cheesy, but I just really encourage prospective students to follow their passions, like pursue research-wise what you want to pursue. So I think sometimes there is a danger that people will try and do a project that they think is will fit someone else's project, or they do a project that they think they should do the project that you want to do, and find a supervisor that will support you to do that. And I think it is important to kind of reach out to people and take opportunities for collaboration. You know, academics are always delighted when someone contacts them and says, I've read your work, I'm really interested in potentially working with you because I like this aspect of your work and this is what interests me. It's a way of opening a conversation. And so, you know, staff are really busy and they can't take, you know, on endless numbers of students. But I think when someone shows that they're really engaged and that they have a passion and they want to pursue it, I think that's often goes a long way. And I think also because, as Lizzie mentioned, doing a PhD, you know, I think can be a real challenge. It can be hard. It's got great things about it, but it also can be really hard. And so you need that passion to sustain you through it, because there's going to be times when it's going to feel like, what am I doing? Why am I doing this? And so if you're not doing the project that you want to do, if you're doing someone else's project or the project you think you're supposed to do, that's not going to carry you through. And so I think those things can be really helpful in getting you through the process and hopefully having it be a positive experience overall. Yeah, so that would be my little bit of advice.
I think you could see both me and Lizzie resonating with that quite strongly. All right, thank you both so much. It was all fascinating. We have just over 10 minutes for questions. I do have a few of my own, but I want to open it up to the floor, as it were, first. If anyone in our audience has any questions, feel free to either post in the chat or raise your hand. Okay, while people were maybe thinking, I, as I say, did make a couple of notes, things. So I was, as I said earlier, my research is particularly looking at using intersectionality as a framework, and I'm particularly looking at media studies, but I was wondering if you sort of we're bringing intersectionality beyond sort of looking at it from a sort of governance and systems and structural kind of point of view, whether you were sort of bringing in ideas of race and, you know, other identities, class maybe on top of gender and sexuality, and how maybe the experience of, say, being a Black trans woman would be different from a white trans woman, for example.
You're on mute.
Sorry, do you want to start or do you want me to?
You go for it. I'll have a little think.
I mean, I think when you talk about the prison, in some ways, like, we're always interested in questions of power. And I don't think you can adequately grapple with power if you're not taking an intersectional approach, especially because prisons are sites that funnel, I mean, they're sites that funnel working class people into the system. They funnel racialized people into the system. They're basically institutions that kind of grab and take people who experience systemic oppression and funnel them into that site. And then those power dynamics, I think, are very prevalent in terms of how everyday interactions and relationships get navigated. And so it does matter how, you know, race and class and sexuality and disability, I would say, is another really big one in the prison system, because lots of people who get funneled into the prison system are people that have disabilities, whether explicitly recognized or not. Mental health issues are very key issues within the prison. And so those are certainly dynamics that I think it's impossible not to navigate them when you're thinking about power.
Yeah, and also if we're thinking about, which I kind of mentioned briefly, this idea of morphic identities and like it's within a sexuality framework, but the idea that, you know, that straightness is still a sexuality, and the way in which people perform their sexuality within the prison site is different to that outside, and that kind of morphic frame, you have to include an intersectional focus on that. And you also, if you want to be doing feminist work, you have to be doing an intersectional approach. Otherwise, you're not really doing feminist work. You're probably just doing like white, able-bodied, cis feminists, and even then it's kind of like, can you even really use the word feminist? So yeah, I think we wouldn't be producing good research if we weren't taking an intersectional approach.
And just sort of jumping off of that as well before we go on to Shannon's question. I was thinking while you were talking about sort of wondering if you saw, just thinking about the right way to word this, place for this kind of research and this way of thinking within prison abolition movements, which obviously are a very big thing in sort of anti-racist and feminist movements, and particularly sort of womanism or black feminism, however you want to word it, whether you see a sort of place, and if you do, how you would see it interacting, if you do see it interacting and having a place in sort of, I suppose, policy discussion within that that area.
I feel like I'm not the person to go first.
Okay. I mean, I think that's a really great question. And actually, it's an opportunity for me to express a little bit of my my misgivings about the project. Because I would say, as someone who wants to see a world without prisons, who wants to see a world where we're not using prisons as a solution to deal with social problems like poverty and homelessness and mental health crisis and the problem of violence in society. For me, a feminist abolitionist frame is partly what helps keep us accountable as researchers. So I think there's a lot of research that can end up expanding the system or fueling the system or justifying the system or naturalizing the system. And for many years, I was very hesitant to do kind of direct, I did a lot of work around prisons from a kind of advocacy and organizing perspective, but I was very wary of kind of bringing my research work into it because of the way in which I think a lot of research actually can fuel and normalize the system. And so I think that frame helps us, when I say it helps us keep accountable, I think it gives us a framework that helps us ask, is the work that we're doing actually aligned with working to create that world that we want, where there is less prisons or no prisons? And for me, harm reduction is not enough. So I want harm reduction to be the frame, but lots of things can be done in the name of harm reduction that actually expand the prison. Like we say, the prison conditions are terrible, so let's build a new, more fancy, high-tech prison because that will make things better. Well, we know from experience that just expands the system, and then they build more and they fill more. They don't close the prisons, or if they close a few, they build even more. We have a massive prison expansion project in this country ongoing, and I think lots of well-meaning projects have kind of helped bolster that. And so I think we really need that frame to constantly be asking ourselves, is the research work that we are doing ensuring that a harm reduction approach is also coupled with a longer term strategy of reducing imprisonment? And so I think actually being slightly uncomfortable about the worry that our research could potentially feed into that is the thing that helps keep us careful and attentive and trying not to slip into that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't really have much to add, and I want to leave time to for Shannon to ask their question. But yeah, I think that the question is a really good one, and it speaks to the kind of.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, can you hear me? Okay.
Sorry.
Yeah.
I think now. Yeah. Sorry.
Sorry. I think the question is a really good one. I think that it kind of speaks to the micro tensions, and yeah, I mean, I would just be repeating what's already been said, but there is, of course, a certain level of discomfort. Like just the other day, we were discussing whether we would kind of work with probation officers, and like you have to work with particular kinds of people whose politics you fundamentally disagree with. And I think that maintaining being in a kind of ambivalent, uncomfortable state is quite useful to stop slipping into this trap of reform rather than abolition. So, good question.
Thank you both for that. That's, yeah, a really interesting perspective. I think a really useful way of looking at it, and I think also useful for other people to hear the value of approaching things from that kind of way as well in research in general, particularly for us who research, those of us who research sort of sociological issues that are very much entwined with like people's experiences of everyday life, you know, and how we of what our sort of intentions is recent. We've got about 5 minutes left. So Shannon, did you want to ask your question? Thank you for being so patient.
Hi, yeah, thank you. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep, we can.
Good, thank you. So yeah, I just want to say thank you for talking about this otherwise quite taboo topic. And I realised halfway through this talk how much silence there is around like this subject. And I work in a men's prison, and I wouldn't dare utter to my colleagues how sexualised the space is, for fear of my own conduct being put under question. And for me, that links to this concept of governance. I feel like sometimes it's considered, in prison at least, as like a one-way application, just to prisoners. But I sort of interpret that as two ways, especially as being like a young female member of staff in a men's prison. I feel like that governance also applies to me. And although not to the same extent that is probably applied to prisoners in terms of their liberation being restricted and things like that, but I do think that it's quite a blurred area, if that makes sense. I don't know if I'm doing this argument any justice or if I'm making any sense, because I feel like I'm just talking on a reflection I've just had. But I was really grateful that you guys brought this topic up for discussion and done it really sensitively. So I just wanted to say that as well. Yeah, that's not really a question. I don't know if you have any reflections on that or any comments, but yeah.
Yeah, thanks so much, Shannon, for reflecting back to us. It's always really helpful to hear how the kind of project lands for people, especially for people who are working in the system. And I think, as you say, the idea that the governance of sexuality applies not just to prisoners, but also to prison staff is something that we certainly are foregrounding in the project. You know, there's different implications of that regulation, but we would say that it is present, and not talking about how that pans out, you know, even the kind of the gender dynamics that you're talking about, if you're working in a prison that is designated for men and you're a woman, what that means in terms of how you do your job and how people respond to you and how people read you. And I think there's like a little bit in the literature that talks about that in a very kind of brief and tangential way, but we think it's actually, it's very important how this space, sexuality and intimacy, plays out for everyone who is in the space, whether it's people who work in the space, people who are visiting the space, people who reside in the space. So yeah, thank you so much. I don't know if you want to add anything, Lizzie.
No, just to echo that, and also that so in one of the prison service journal articles, there was also a really random one-off mention of a sexual culture within management. So there's also the sexualities between staff and officers, and between officers and staff and staff. So yeah, we're applying this not just in a kind of like top-down way, but thinking about how it permeates all of the relations within prison. But thank you for your point and your reflection. It's really interesting.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks everyone. Does anyone, because I'm aware that we're sort of at 3 o'clock, does anyone have any other questions for our speakers? Otherwise, I will probably draw this to a close, if unless either of you had any sort of closing remarks that you wanted to make, as it were. But
just
don't
to
feel pressured to.
Naomi, for organising and for chairing. I know you don't usually chair, but I think you did a really good job, and appreciate the effort you put into organising this series and in the student union more broadly.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's been great.
Thank you so much for agreeing to do this. It's absolutely fascinating, and I look forward to seeing the sort of ongoing results of your work, because it does sound really important and, you know, a really valuable thing to be doing. Very I think very interesting from a students' union point as well. Like, it very much intersects with the sort of issues that we're particularly concerned with in sort of institutions in general, not just in prisons, and how those sort of systems impact on the people who are existing within them, both sort of social, political, and you know, the systems that in the workplace and governance and stuff. So yeah, thank you so much for coming, and to everyone for joining us. We do have another one of these events coming up next Friday as well, so please do check out our website for more details, and to book if you're interested in coming to that, which will be our last one in the series. And finally, I hope you all enjoy the rest of your day. We'll
Bye,
stop
thank
the
you.
Bye,
recording now.
everyone.